becoming a researcher in 2026 is still better than the choice that I made of becoming a researcher in 2005. And I want you to really emphasize or pay attention to what I'm actually saying. I want you to start looking at all of the indications. So, 2025 in America, in the world, I live in America, but I'm Canadian. I pay attention to things. There's lots of world events that are going on. There's interesting things. That's all I'm going to allude to that are going on in higher education that many of us, pay attention to, from, whether it's different ways of funding, whether it is, there's violence that's happening, whether that there is, um, protections at your schools, for example. There was I'll be very real. There was a shooting at my school this year, very close to my office. And what I want to say is that I still would do, if I was to choose to become a researcher, it's far better for you to do it now than it was when I started to do it. And I know that sounds really, I'm an old fart kind of thing. It's only 20 years ago. It's not that long ago. But I want to put things into perspective. You know, um, I study business. And one of the things that when I started my PhD, that, you know, if you were to look at most economies around the world, most countries around the world, other than the few Western countries back in 2005, you would have saw a lot of impoverished people. And there was many countries that were essentially no-go. You wouldn't go there because it was too violent. Now, in 2026, most of those countries, if you go back to them and you take a look at them, you realize that they are thriving metropolises often. It's staggering when you look at the pictures of cities that were very much impoverished. Many cities in India, many cities in China, many cities in Indonesia, um, many cities in Brazil. When I was going through, it was very much dangerous and impoverished to go to some of these places. Today, I know of many people, relatives and folks around me that go to these cities and enjoy them. They have fun, and they're very much thriving metropolises with shiny new buildings, beautiful places, and are relatively safe to go to. Relatively, because I say like going to America is relatively safe. Um, quote unquote. I want you to look at access to education and access to educational tools. When I started my PhD, they were just finishing up, Google was just finishing up transforming many textbooks, written textbooks, into digital form. There was a project where Google was doing that. Google itself, Google searching, was kind of new. It was only 5, 6 years old. I would have had to, and I remember at that time we were going through a transition. I had to go to the library to get many books and many articles, research articles, that were still in paper form. Now, it's still kind of, you can run into that issue every once in a while, but generally not so much today. When I was doing my PhD, we had no artificial intelligence. I had to write everything out myself, and I had to slowly think about things. And I would get in, if I got interrupted writing a sentence, I would forget everything. Now with artificial intelligence, I can think instead of thinking in words, which is somebody with, um, ADHD, and I'm very sure that I have dyslexia. If thinking in words is very difficult to do compared to thinking in sentences or blocks of ideas, what you do in artificial intelligence today. Now it's a lot more fluid. I feel like I'm actually having a conversation that I would normally have. I Some of the tools, so transcription, it was very common, and I had to get somebody, and I had to pay an enormous amount of money to get somebody to transcribe interviews. Now there is, and it was very expensive. I would say, $1,000 per hour or so of interviewing of transcription. Very expensive. Now you can get a tool that transcribes everything that you say. In fact, your phone does that to you. Transcribes everything that you say in a matter of seconds, and it does it with pretty good accuracy. And as well, it costs pennies. If anything, you could do things that are relatively cheap. Doing formulas. So before, we either had to use some sort of, I used often Microsoft Equation Editor. It was brutally difficult to use. And the Microsoft Equation Editor that we have today is very different than what it was back then. It would take hours and hours and hours to use it. Today, you can get ChatGPT to say, do this equation, and it will write out a beautiful scripted equation in a very quick way, almost instantaneously. So to get my thoughts, which I think kind of in terms of equations, but I often can't spit them out because I have, the ADHD dyslexia. It's very difficult for me to go to that next little step. I can easily spit those out and easily think about those. And it comes out in a very nice, presentable, beautiful way. There is many different moments like this that you will see that there's very big differences and a great time to go do research. Another thing you might think about is, well, what about all of the violence, or the different access to visas? The same thing was happening then. In the countries, many of the countries, there were still restrictions on different visas, different degrees, different countries, um, all sorts of complexity that was happening at that moment as well. And if you think that the world was free of politics at that moment, I beg to differ. There was a lot of political tension that was happening in many countries around the world, and that were having strange conversations that you would look at, you would say, well, why on earth is that happening? And you would get very, very anxious about paying attention to that. Now, there is one subtle difference. Oh, another access to digital technology, and this is related, is social media. I get access to state-of-the-art ideas that I would never have gotten access to, and I would had to have wait for journals to come out. Now, there's some complexity today. Now, there's a lot more knowledge that we get access to, and as a human being, it's extraordinarily difficult to keep on top of that knowledge that we get access to. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is that social media is optimized for engagement. Most of the platforms are optimized for engagement. So what does that mean? What do humans engage with? Anything that causes controversy or feels negative. So I know that many things are not going to get engagement unless they cause controversy. What does that do for a human being? That causes a lot of anxiety. So the way that we process information through newspapers at the time, which were still relatively common, wasn't as sensational as it is today. It doesn't feel the same sort of emotional attachment. And that's the thing that I want you to really pay attention to here, is that the world, and if you look at all indications of, wealth, all indications of, the amount of people that are in dire poverty, all indications of, um, you name it, right? People that are starving, you'll see that despite the fact, yes, there is probably more, and definitively there's more wealth disparity. So the rich are getting richer, and the poor are kind of gradually growing and getting better. If we acknowledge that as maybe it's a flaw, I don't know. It's hard to, there's a lot of debate about it and whether we should look at it negatively or positively. But if you were to look at the people that need it the most of those people are uniformly far better off today. Most, not all, most of them are far better off today around the world, in your country, than they were back in 2005. Not only that, many of you that are listening to this from places around the world would never have gotten access to this information, and were told that you can actually go and become a researcher. So I know that there's somebody in rural in Italy right now, in a very remote place, that's listening to this. I don't even know who they are, but they're listening to this and they're saying, I could become a researcher and the world is better off, and I should try to actually do this thing. I want you to really internalize this, that there is a tremendous amount of goodness that exists in this world. There is tremendous amount of positive things that you should be paying attention to. Uniformly, most indications are that we're better off across the board. When I started my PhD, when I started doing, research as a profession, I want you to internalize this. The world is far better today than it ever was, and you have far more access to opportunities than you would ever have access to. So another thing, one last thing to point out. Many of you are coming from different countries. And when I started, it was really uncommon for people to go to a unique country that was not a Western country once they did their PhD. Going to, if you made it to America, you sort of made it. If you were in Canada, you made it. And you went to England, you made it. Um, all of those kind of things. But what we are seeing now, slowly, are that there are some countries around the world that are getting access to where you can get opportunities to actually do your work in those particular countries. It's slow. There's not as many opportunities as I would hope, but there's still opportunities that are emerging, and that they're wonderful, and that it's changing. And I want you to internalize this. The world is becoming uniformly better off. There's many more opportunities for doing research in 2026 than there was 20 years ago when I started. Take care and have a wonderful day.